It started with a phone call that should have meant nothing. Just my daughter's voice on a Sunday morning, soft, almost apologetic. "Dad, can we come by later? Ethan wants to show you something." Her tone had that careful politeness she used when she was about to tell me something I wouldn't like. I was sanding the porch railing of my new house, the one I'd built with my own hands after Martha passed away. Every plank carried her memory, the pine scent she loved, the squeak of the floorboard she used to tease me about. The cabin was my peace, my fresh start. When I hung up, I stood there for a moment, watching the sun bleed through the trees. The woods were still wet from the night's rain, glistening. I'd always imagined this place would stay quiet, no city noise, no neighbors, no drama. Just me, a wood stove, and a lifetime of silence. That afternoon, a white Tesla rolled up the dirt road, spitting gravel and arrogance. Ethan climbed out first, wearing a blazer too expensive for the woods. Lydia followed, her eyes flicking to me, nervous. And in the back seat, I noticed two silhouettes. An older couple. I frowned. "You brought guests?" Ethan grinned like he owned the place. "Thought you wouldn't mind, Jack. My folks wanted to see your masterpiece. You've done something incredible here." He spread his arms, as if he were introducing a property he was about to list. His parents stepped out, Mr. and Mrs. Green, all pearls and polished shoes. They looked at my cabin like it was a cute novelty, something they might buy for the holidays. "Oh, isn't this quaint?" Mrs. Green said, running her fingers along the porch post. I didn't realize retirement could be so rustic. Lydia gave me a small, pleading smile. "Dad, don't mind her. They're just curious," Ethan cut in. "Actually, we wanted to talk about something." "Inside?" I led them in, though something in my gut told me not to. The cabin's interior still smelled of varnish and coffee, my coffee. The sunlight caught the framed photo of Martha on the mantel. Her smile was small, secretive, the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Ethan made himself comfortable on my couch. His parents sat beside him, all polite postures. Lydia stayed near the kitchen counter, twisting her ring. "Jack," Ethan began, leaning forward. "You know how much we admire what you've done here. It's beautiful, peaceful, and frankly practical." "Practical?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Well, yes. It's only 20 minutes from town. Closer to our work than our current place. And with the market being what it is, Lydia and I thought, maybe it's time we consolidate." He paused, giving a salesman's smile. "You've got all this space. It'd make sense if we moved in, just temporarily, of course, until we find something bigger. My parents could take the guest room. They'd love the scenery." The words hit me like sawdust in the throat. "Your parents? Here?" "Just for a while," Lydia said quickly. "Dad, it's only until Ethan's promotion goes through. You'd hardly notice us. We could help with groceries, cooking, anything you need." "Lydia." I set my cup down carefully. "This is my home. I built it for your mother and me. Not as a rental property for extended family." Ethan's smile tightened. "Come on, Jack. You've got 3 bedrooms. You're not exactly using all that space. We're family. Isn't that what this place is for?" I stared at him. There was something cold behind his charm, something that made my skin crawl. Martha used to say, "People like that smile with their teeth, not their hearts." Mrs. Green chimed in, sipping from a thermos she'd brought. "It's only fair, Mr. Miller. Families stick together. Ethan works hard. Lydia deserves comfort. You've got your peace and quiet. Why not share it?" I felt something twist in my chest, not anger yet, just disbelief. Lydia's eyes were damp. She mouthed, "Please, Dad. We could even handle maintenance," Ethan added. "Keep it in shape for you. You could visit any time. Think of it as us helping you." Helping me. That's when I knew this wasn't a conversation. It was an invasion. I leaned back, keeping my voice even. "You came here with a plan, didn't you, Ethan?" He laughed, rubbing his hands together. No, nothing like that. Just thinking long term. Family legacy, right? You're not getting any younger, Jack. Why let this place sit empty when it could serve the family? The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the clock ticking. For a brief second, I saw Martha's reflection in the photo glass, like she was watching from behind it. Her eyes said everything mine couldn't. I stood up slowly. You're right about one thing, Ethan. It will serve the family. Just not the way you think. His brows drew together. What's that supposed to mean? I smiled faintly. You'll see. They left a few minutes later, Ethan, annoyed, Lydia quiet, his parents, whispering something smug. When their car disappeared between the trees, I walked to the porch and looked at the empty road. The sun was setting, orange bleeding through the branches. I finished my cold coffee, then turned Martha's photo face down. Whatever peace this house once had, it was over. But something else had just begun. They wanted my kindness. Instead, they woke my silence. 3 days passed before Lydia called again. I didn't pick up the first 2 times. The third time, she showed up at the gate. Alone, at least that's what I thought, until I saw the silver SUV parked down the hill. Ethan was inside, watching through the windshield. She walked up the gravel path, wrapped in a beige coat, eyes red from crying. Dad, can we talk? I wiped my hands on a rag. If this is about Sunday. It's not, she said quickly. Or not exactly. Ethan's he's under a lot of pressure, Dad. He didn't mean to sound pushy. Pushy? I raised an eyebrow. He brought his parents to my house and started talking about family consolidation. That's not pushy, sweetheart. That's presumptuous. She bit her lip, glancing back at the SUV. He just wants stability. We both do. Rent's gone up again, and his parents can't handle their mortgage anymore. He thought maybe we could stay here for a while. All of us. All of you, I echoed. Her silence confirmed it. Just for 6 months, she said softly. You'd still have your space. We could even add a little extension for them. Ethan said he'd handle the permits. Permits? I felt the word hit like a hammer. Lydia, he's planning to build on my land? He didn't mean it that way. He said it's an investment, for me, for our future. He said you'd want me to be secure. I looked at her for a long time. My little girl, the same one who used to bring me lemonade while I fixed fences, who believed in fairy tales and honesty. Now she was parroting someone else's voice. Lydia, do you even hear yourself? You're asking me to let that man move into my house, bring his parents, and start building on my land, all because he says it's an investment? She winced. He's my husband, Dad. I have to trust him. I sighed. And you think I don't trust you? I'm trying to protect you from a man who treats family like a business deal. She stepped closer, her tone shifting, defensive now. Ethan isn't like that. He loves me. He wants to build something real. You're just holding on to Mom's memory too tightly. This house, this life, it's like you're frozen in time. That stung more than I wanted to admit. I turned away, pretending to check the woodpile. Maybe I am. But I'd rather be frozen in truth than melted by lies. Her phone buzzed. Ethan again. She didn't answer, but I saw his name flash on the screen. Please, Dad, she whispered. Just think about it. For me. I already have. She left with tears in her eyes. The SUV backed down the road, tires crunching over stone. I stood there until the sound disappeared. That night, rain returned. Heavy, relentless. I sat by the window, bourbon in hand, watching the lightning flicker through the trees. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it was over, that she'd come to her senses. Then I saw the headlights. They stopped at the bottom of the drive. Ethan's car. He didn't even bother knocking this time. He strutted onto the porch like he owned it, rain dripping from his coat. Evening, Jack. Got a minute? No. I'll make it quick. I talked to Lydia, She told me you're hesitant. I get it. You're proud. This place means something to you. But let's be practical. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Contracts. I had my assistant draw up some transfer options. Partial ownership, nothing drastic. You keep 50%, we manage the rest. Taxes, upkeep, all covered. You'd get monthly payments, passive income. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. You want to buy my house from me? Not buy. Share. It's a win-win. I stared at the folder. And what if I say no? He smiled, calm, confident. Then Lydia will. She's your heir, after all. Sooner or later, it'll be hers. I'm just speeding up the inevitable. That was it. The moment the floor dropped out beneath everything I thought I still had. Get out, I said quietly. You're making a mistake, Jack. Maybe. But it's mine to make. He hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice. You know, stubbornness isn't a virtue. Lydia worries about you up here all alone. What if something happens? A fall. A fire. You should think about the future. That wasn't concern, it was a warning wrapped in velvet. I met his gaze. I am thinking about the future, Ethan. Yours. He blinked, confused. Then smirked. Suit yourself. He left the folder on the porch railing. The papers inside fluttered in the wind and scattered like dead leaves. When the taillights vanished, I picked one up. It was a transfer of ownership draft, already filled with my name and Lydia's signature. For a long minute, I couldn't breathe. The betrayal wasn't just Ethan's. It was hers too. The next morning, I drove into town. I didn't tell anyone, not even Lydia. At the county records office, I found what I was afraid of, an inquiry filed under Ethan Green's name. Preliminary land usage request, it said. Under intended purpose. Family annex and future rental development. My stomach turned cold. He wasn't just planning to move in. He was planning to take over. For a minute my pulse was louder. When I left the office, the sky was pale and heavy with rain again. The world felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. Back at the cabin, I sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames until they blurred. My phone buzzed with a message from Lydia. Lydia. Dad, please talk to Ethan. We can fix this. Me. No, Lydia. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. I poured another drink and stared at the flickering shadows. I remembered the way Martha used to sit by this same fire, telling me, when people show you who they are, believe them. That night I did. And by morning, I'd made my decision. If Ethan wanted a piece of my world, he was about to choke on it. They came for comfort. They'll leave with consequences. I woke the next morning with the taste of old coffee and a new kind of resolve. The house was quiet in that way only empty rooms can be, every sound exaggerated, like it was waiting to be measured. I padded to the kitchen, poured a cup, and sat at the table with the transfer draft Ethan had left on the porch. The paper looked innocent, names, dates, a fine-printed promise of shared stewardship. But inside those clauses lived a different language: leverage, control, slow erosion. Martha used to say vengeance is a messy thing, but justice is surgical. I'd been a carpenter my whole life. I knew the difference between blunt force and a clean cut. If I was going to respond, I'd make sure it was with the latter. My first call was to James. James Harper had been my lawyer for 15 years, ever since I needed help with the estate after Martha's hospital bills. He's the kind of man who smells faintly of pipe smoke and good leather, and thinks in footnotes. When I told him what had happened, he didn't sound surprised. That was worse than shock. You don't let them in, Jack. Not for anything legal until we look at that filing. And do not sign a thing, under any circumstance. He already filed a preliminary inquiry. Preliminaries all the better. If Ethan thinks he can steamroll you, he's misread the family. I felt better already. There's comfort in bureaucracy when people use it to protect you. After James, I called someone else, someone less comfortable, and far more useful. Tommy Reyes used to be in security. He ran private investigations now, a lean man with a messy beard and a reputation for finding what people didn't want found. I'd met him once at the hardware store when he paid cash for 3 chainsaws and told a bawdy joke about hedges. He'd laugh like it was the first good thing all week. "You want me to look into Ethan Green?" I asked. "You want me to dig or to warn him off?" "Dig." "All right." "How deep?" Deep enough, I thought. Over the next week, my life rearranged itself around small operations. I kept working on the cabin, hands in wood, head in plans. It was my alibi, out in the daylight, nothing to betray me. At night I moved through paperwork, red pen in hand, tracing possibilities like a man marking studs in a wall. There were other things, mortgage inquiries, a credit pull on Lydia's name, an application for an emergency maintenance loan on a property he didn't own. It was sloppy for a man who liked to smile that much. Sloppy was a weakness I could exploit. Tommy came back with his first report 2 days later. He'd run background checks, social media, and a few human conversations that don't show up on Google. By week's end, Tommy had every signature we need, clean, sworn, undeniable. "He's a hustler," Tommy said, pouring coffee into a dented thermos at my kitchen table. "Lots of short-term wins, no long-term assets. He sells the idea of security better than the real thing. Oh, and he's got a side company that handles client relocations. Sounds legit until you see the clients are mostly elderly folks who get pressured into bad contracts." "Pressure," I repeated. The word lodged in my throat. "And his parents?" "Sympathetic. Played well. But they're more a prop than a source of pressure. Ethan's been cutting angles to build something he can flip." I listened and took notes, like I had a blueprint in front of me. There were moral questions, too. Revenge is easy to satisfy on a visceral level. You see the other man stumble and you feel vindicated. But each time I pictured Ethan humiliated, I also pictured Lydia looking at him through a different kind of light, the one that knows secrets, and then must decide whether to love anyway. I didn't want to ruin her life. I wanted truth and boundaries. That thinking guided the plan: expose the method, preserve the daughter, protect my legacy. The next move was practical. I changed the locks. It sounds dramatic, but it was mostly paperwork and brass. I called a locksmith under an assumed pretext and had him install a secondary deadbolt, one keyed only to me. I placed a small, inexpensive security camera under the eaves, nothing modern or flashy, just a lens. I didn't post signs. If they were coming like vultures, I wanted them to think the place remained alone. Then I set bait. Ethan had left the transfer draft with his assistant's name on the header. Names are crumbs. Tommy traced the assistant to a co-working office. He called, friendly-like, pretending to be a confused client asking about shared ownership paperwork. The assistant, eager and careless, forwarded a copy of email threads that mentioned Lydia's possible consent, and a phrase that made my skin crawl: a gentle nudge. I saved it, printed it, and slid it into a folder labeled for James. At night, I rehearsed conversations, not to be cruel, but to be precise. If I confronted Ethan in a rage, he'd deflect, he'd charm. Some nights I wondered if exposing him would cost me my daughter entirely, but silence would have cost her more. If I presented facts, he'd flinch. The law is slow and procedural, shame is immediate. I planned to use both. I also considered other tools. There are fines and bureaucracies that make people in the property game squirm. If Ethan had been filing sneakily, then exposing his networks would complicate his life: tax audits, licensing checks, calls from people who work in banks and take such things seriously. Tommy could find one phone call to the right regulator and watch Ethan's smile vanish as paperwork multiplied. But there's something else I wanted even more than to unravel his schemes: confession. People who are cornered often tell the truth, and truth from their own mouths is harder to spin than anything you can read in a file. I wanted Lydia to hear the plan laid out plainly: the ledger of deceit, the part where promises are money and love becomes a transaction. So I crafted a confrontation that would be surgical, not vengeful. Step 1. Gather irrefutable documents: the drafted transfer, the assistant's emails, the county inquiry, and evidence of his relocation, company preying on the elderly. Step 2. Arrange for witnesses who could corroborate: James for the legal interpretation, Tommy for the investigative findings, and if needed, a neighbor who would speak to any odd comings and goings. Step 3. Isolate Ethan emotionally, force him into a position where his options were binary: explain in front of people, or be exposed. And Step 4. Offer Lydia the truth and the choice. It's strange how calm you can be when you're not making threats but just marking the steps you'll follow. My hands moved like a draftsman's, measured and precise. The fury that had lived under my ribs softened into workmanlike focus. I talk to myself when I build things. I tell the wood what I want it to do. It sounds ridiculous, but it helps me remember why I do it. This was the same. I told the plan to the house like a prayer. While I organized paperwork and called in favors, life kept pushing small inconveniences my way. A brake light on my truck needed replacing. Lydia showed up with a casserole and lingered too long, apologizing for things she hadn't done aloud. Ethan left a voicemail, 3 words repeated like a metronome. "Let's talk, Dad." My reply was measured. I invited him to dinner, at my place, that Friday. Public enough that neither of us could spring a stunt, private enough to control the setting. I told James and Tommy the night and asked them to come by separately with their own reasons. James would drop off some paperwork. Tommy would need to return a tool he'd borrowed. Both agreed. On Friday, I cleaned the house until the wood gleamed. I made Martha's meatloaf, a ridiculous thing to do when you're plotting, but there it is, rituals matter. The smell of onions and rosemary filled the kitchen and steadied me. I set the table with 2 plates, then added 3 more. Psychology, like any good carpenter knows, is part of the design. Ethan arrived first, slick and sure. He stepped into my living room like the proprietor of a model home, eyes skimming for opportunities. Lydia followed, apologetic and tired. When James came by with his briefcase, he sat and began to talk about boring legal stuff: contingencies, title protections, what a preliminary filing implies. Tommy borrowed a wrench and stayed just long enough to watch a little of the conversation, his gaze attentive. I watched Ethan while James spoke. Every so often the man smiled, that well-practiced charm, but there was thinness under it, a little dryness like paint flaking. James asked a pointed question about the transfer draft. The smile faltered. "Was that draft left on my porch, Ethan?" I asked quietly. "It was a draft, Jack. A proposal. With Lydia's name already on it?" I pressed. She signed preliminarily, yes. She thought it was practical." Lydia's hand went to her mouth. The room hummed with a new electric current, shame, like a wire suddenly made live. "Practical?" James said, voice polite but sharp. "You do realize filing inquiries under another's name without express, notarized consent could be considered undue influence, Mr. Green?" Ethan bristled. "What are you implying? That someone might have been acting without full transparency?" James opened his briefcase and placed copies on the table: the assistant's emails, the county inquiry, the draft with Lydia's name. Tommy slid a small envelope across, his eyes calm but steely. Inside, 2 signed affidavits from elderly clients of Ethan's relocation company, saying they felt pressured into contracts. The air changed. Lydia's face blanched and then reddened. Ethan sputtered and then tried to charm. He failed. The facts stacked like boards in a wall. I didn't speak much. I let them do their own destruction for me. People are better at explaining themselves when they believe they can still control the narrative. Ethan lunged for the narrative, and found it had been nailed down. At one point Lydia looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. It wasn't a villain's reveal so much as a human quieting, a moment where the story you believed collapses under its weight. Ethan started. He looked around, searching faces as if for an ally. There were none. "Lydia," he pleaded, "I was trying to secure our future. By signing me to something I didn't fully understand?" She said, voice small and not a little betrayed. "Ethan, you put my name on papers without telling me the whole truth." He stammered, and his charm ate itself. The room offered no applause, only the slow, satisfying sound of a structure failing under proof. When the night wound down, Lydia left to sleep in Ethan's car. She needed distance. Ethan lingered, angry now but exposed. He looked at me as if I had tricked him somehow, as if I'd cheated by gathering paper instead of striking with a fist. Maybe he believed in different rules. I respected that. I also respected consequences. Before he left, he turned to me. "This isn't over, Jack." "No," I said. "Not yet. But now it's on record." He went. The taillights blinked through the trees and then dissolved. I stayed up late that night, the house humming with the memory of words. Martha's photograph faced up again. I touched the frame and felt more clarity than I had in weeks. Revenge, when your aim is truth, can be merciful. It can be a way of clearing underbrush so things left standing can breathe. I had started a machine. It was small and quiet for now, just a few well-placed gears. But it would move, and when it did, it would make a sound everyone would hear. And somewhere beneath the planning, under the legal filings and the camera lenses and the quiet dinners, a different, softer thought took root. Maybe this would give Lydia something she needed more than a house. The chance to see the man she loved as he truly was, and to choose. I didn't want to steal her choice, only to return it to her unclouded. That was the pledge I made to the house, and to Martha's picture on the mantel. I would not be the destroying hand. I would be the revealing one. When the dawn crept across the floorboards, I felt ready. The trap needed building. The next phase would be construction. I like to think of revenge the way I think of a fine dovetail joint, clean, snug, and matched so the other piece has no room to wiggle. The trap had to be the same, invisible until the moment you notice there's no way out. The week after the dinner I moved into a rhythm of small, precise actions. Days were for the visible work, fixing a loose stair, laying new weather strips, sweeping the porch so it looked untouched. Nights were for the unseen, printing documents, lining envelopes, rehearsing what I would say and when I would say it. First, consolidate evidence. James and Tommy worked like clockwork. James filed a formal notice with the county clerk contesting the preliminary usage inquiry on grounds of undue influence and misrepresentation. That alone would slow any permit process until a hearing. Tommy rounded up the human pieces. 2 elderly clients who'd been pressured into signing contracts by Ethan's company, a disgruntled former assistant with email threads, and a contractor who had been stiffed on small jobs and remembered Ethan's promises more sharply when asked. I read each affidavit twice. The stories were the same: a soft smile, a gentle nudge, a rushed signature. My stomach churned in sympathy for the victims, and in a thin thread of pity for the man who had become a habit of harm. Second, create a venue. If you expose someone in private, they deny it. If you expose them with witnesses, documents, and a camera, they flail. I decided on a staged, final meeting. Ethan would think he was being welcomed toward ownership. Instead, he'd be walking into a room where everything he'd built would be catalogued and contrasted. I sent Lydia an invitation via email. No words about confrontation, just an offer to talk publicly about future plans. And a note that James would also drop by to check some paperwork. I made it sound casual on purpose, a family lunch to smooth things over. Ethan read it like a man expecting a signature. I asked 2 neighbors to be present without telling them the full script. Mrs. Calloway, who lived 3 houses down and baked pies for the whole street, agreed to come because she liked Lydia. Mr. Alvarez, who ran the feed store, said he'd stop by because he always liked to keep the peace. They were simple people, ordinary eyes. Ordinary eyes are useful. They notice nervous hands, forced smiles, and they weigh the smallness of a lie in the room air. Third, technical security. The small camera under the eaves had been recording for weeks. but for the confrontation I wanted better angles. Tommy brought a body camera, the kind security guards use, and I set it in Lydia's purse before she left home that morning, with her consent, of course. A second, discreet recorder sat on the mantel, hidden behind a jar of screws. I don't like trickery that could be used for harm. I like trickery that allowed truth to speak. Fourth, set the emotional bait. People like to close a deal. They crave the feeling of completion, the neatness of signing. So I let Ethan feel that he was closing something, that the house would be his to share after a friendly signing. I drafted a fake memorandum of understanding, something that looked official enough to make him relax but vague enough to be meaningless legally. He would love the sensation, dominate, secure, the man who finally made the old man bend. Behind that memorandum, we placed the real pieces, the affidavits, the assistant's emails, the county notice, and a small stack of testimonials from the elderly clients. James prepared a 2-page summary that stripped legalese into blunt language anyone could understand. Evidence indicates undue influence. Further review required. Tommy printed the relocation complaints, binding them into a small booklet that lay on the coffee table like a magazine. All that remained was timing, and a little theater. On the morning of the meeting I baked a pie. Old habits. The smell of apples filled the kitchen, it grounded me. Lydia came early, fragile but determined. She held my hand for a long moment in the doorway before stepping inside. "Dad," she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." I squeezed her fingers and told the truth I always tell when the world tilts. "You can. You're not alone." Ethan arrived later, confident in a way that was brittle, the brittle confidence of a man who's been on stage too long. He wore his usual blazer, the one that pretends to be a second skin. He brought coffee, which I poured into cups, and a small leather folder he tapped like a drum. "Nice place for the family, Jack?" he said, settling in. "I was hoping we could actually start making things happen today. Sign a memorandum, get James to advise, and we move forward." He smiled at Lydia. She forced one back and sat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. James arrived on time, briefcase like a shield. He sat, opened it, and began with the technicalities: how preliminary filings don't transfer rights, what the county will require, what signatures actually mean. Ethan nodded as if he understood, but kept leaning forward as if to speed the conversation along whenever it slowed. Then Tommy walked in, wiping his hands on his jacket. He had arranged for the 2 elderly clients to be present. They waited in the car because they were shy about public appearances. I handed Tommy the pie and told him, "When I say, have them come in." It was a small stage direction that felt enormous. I started the lunch like any ordinary host, small talk about weather, how the wood was settling, a recall of something funny that happened when Lydia was a child. Ethan ate, smiling over each bite like a man on a commercial. I let him speak, let him spin the future. He talked about shared stewardship, passive income, legacy. He folded my words into prophecies. At the right moment, James set down his fork and said, "Mr. Green, I'm going to be blunt. I need to lay out what I found." He pulled documents from his briefcase, placed them on the table, and slid the assistant's emails toward Ethan. Ethan's face didn't change at first. It's a strange thing to see someone try to maintain composure as facts begin to crowd them, like watching a man build a dam and then see the water begin to soak the soil beneath. Tommy let the thermostat on the situation rise another degree. He walked to the window and opened the door. "Mrs. Henderson? They're ready," he called softly. The elderly clients shuffled in, supported by canes and one by a nephew. Their clothes were simple and clean. They sat with dignity and trembled slightly, which made the room feel like a courtroom more than a kitchen. "Mr. Green," one of them began, voice thin but steady. "You asked me to sign papers I didn't have time to read. You said it was just to secure my move. I didn't know what it would mean." The words landed like stones. Lydia's face drained, confusion flickering into horror. Ethan's jaw worked. He started to talk, to apologize, to explain, to insist on miscommunication, but each defense met an affidavit James placed quietly on the table: dates, times, the names of callers, the exact phrases. "You'd be better off." And, "This is for your comfort." I hadn't raised my voice once. I didn't need to. The room had become an instrument playing its own chord: facts, faces, and recorded voices. The body cam in Lydia's purse whispered everything into the hard drive. The camera on the mantel caught Ethan's hands, which began to shake visibly for the first time since I'd known him. When he tried to pull the conversation toward the memorandum I'd planted, James flipped through it and laughed softly, the laugh of someone who finds imbecility amusing. "This draft," he said, "is not only unenforceable, it's dishonest. It references consent that isn't notarized, claims of authority that don't exist, and signatures that were not obtained freely." Ethan's face went red, then pale. His voice rose. He accused, he deflected, he tried to charm his way out. The neighbors looked on. They were quietly horrified and equally appalled. Mrs. Calloway dabbed her eyes. At one point Lydia stood up and screamed, a pure human sound that sent the dogs in the nearest yard howling. "Why would you do this to me?" she cried. "Why would you sign me up for something I never agreed to?" Her question hung heavy in the rafters. Ethan's answer was the one I'd been waiting for, not the polished explanation, but the slip. He reached for the excuse that family matters, that it was for their security, and then, as if forgetting the cameras, he said quietly, "We needed leverage. If we had the house, the bank would extend a loan, and we could flip the property in a year." It was all math. It was the phrase that finished him. Leverage. Math. The room drank the words like a bitter medicine. Tommy's call to a former client, and the printouts of complaints, made the rest of the story simple. Ethan wasn't trying to secure a home, he was trying to secure capital. When the meeting broke up, it didn't feel like a fight so much as a collapse. Ethan left last, his face a map of fury and shame. Lydia followed him out, not speaking. The elderly clients were escorted back to their car by a neighbor. Later, when the court notices arrived in my mailbox and the county placed a hold on any permit process connected to the property, I felt a thin ribbon of triumph. The legal trap was functioning as it should, slow, boring, and utterly effective. But the practical stage of the trap wasn't over. People like Ethan change strategy. They call in favors, they lie to strangers, they attempt to reframe stories. So I prepared to close the circle another way. I asked the county to schedule a public hearing about the preliminary filing. I asked local reporters, a neighbor who writes for the small town paper, who knew the elderly clients, to attend. I made sure the timeline allowed for any last-minute attempts to obfuscate. I wanted this out in the open where spin couldn't hide. Finally, I left an open envelope on the porch that evening, with a note, folded carefully. Inside was a simple invitation. "We'll discuss this again on Thursday at noon. Bring all your documents. Bring your conscience." I didn't expect an answer, I expected a performance. When Ethan came back that Thursday, he looked ready for war. He was not alone. He'd managed to find a lawyer who'd not yet seen the affidavits and a friend from the agency to vouch for him. He tried to up the stakes, to bring heat to the room. But we had a record now, recorded voice, written affidavits, printed complaints, public notices. He was a man trying to light a match under a barrel of water. As the hearing unfolded, a small, local thing but satisfying, Ethan's options unwound. He spoke. We showed. The public record favored reality over rhetoric. People who had been on the fence watched as the fabric of his plan frayed. At night, after everyone left, I would sit on the porch and listen. The trap had teeth, but it wasn't personal cruelty that drove me, it was protection. I thought about Lydia's future and about the little things that remain after a fight: a picture on a mantel, a wooden spoon, a footprint in the dust. I wanted those things to stay mine. The plan was working. The pieces were in place. Now all that remained was to trigger the mechanism that would make Ethan feel the consequences in front of everyone he tried to impress. The execution would come soon, and it would need to be clean, undeniable, and merciful to those who deserved it. When I turned in that night, the house smelled faintly of apple and pine. The camera lenses gleamed darkly in the corner, keeping their quiet vigil. My hands smelled of sawdust and paper. I felt oddly, like a craftsman finishing the last dovetail, the joint closed neat, the structure sound. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would set the final pieces in motion. They say the scariest thing you can do to a man who gambles with other people's lives is to make his bets public. I decided the table would be set in a place he couldn't buy, other people's eyes. Thursday arrived with that brittle sunlight that makes everything look clearer than it usually is. I woke before dawn, as I always do, and stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted like the rest of the week, strong, practical, unromantic. I dressed in the jacket Martha hated because she said it made me look too serious. Seriousness was the point. By 10 the yard was already filling up. Mrs. Kellaway brought another pie. Mr. Alvarez parked his truck and kept looking at the house with a satisfied nod. The elderly clients arrived again, steady this time, supported by family. A reporter from the town paper, the neighbor I'd asked, parked at the end of the drive and set up a small recorder. He smiled at me like he was on my side. I nodded because allies are important. Ethan arrived with a different energy than before. There was a thin rage behind his practiced composure, and he brought a lawyer who smelled faintly of expensive coffee and confidence. He swept into the kitchen like a man who thought he was still in a sales pitch, and went immediately for the folder he liked to tap. "Jack," he said, false warmth in his voice. "I'm surprised to see so many people here. We can handle this privately." He looked at the gathering as if they were flies he could shoo. That look is what I'd been waiting for, the arrogance that thinks witnesses are decoration rather than judges. I waited until coffee was set down, until Lydia sat between us, hands folded like someone holding a fragile thing. Then I started. "Ethan," I said, "you told us about a memorandum. You told us it was to make things easier. You left a draft on my porch. You placed an inquiry with the county listing my property for family annex and future rental development. You put my daughter's name on papers she didn't fully consent to." He opened his mouth to smooth it over. I let him. Let him speak until the sound of his own voice thinned and ragged. James stood, and calm as a man in a courtroom, laid the documents on the table. The assistant emails, notarized affidavits from the elderly clients, county filings, printed complaints from people who had been pressured into signing with Ethan's relocation company. Tommy handed the reporter a copy of the affidavits and nodded. The reporter's recorder clicked on and caught everything. Ethan's lawyer tried to interject with objections about admissibility and privacy. James countered, polite and inexorable. This was a public matter now. People had been harmed. The county had already placed a hold on any permits. The law moves slow sometimes, but when the facts are simple, the truth can hurry it along. The elderly clients were brought forward, one by one. They told their stories in voices that trembled and then strengthened. They described the way Ethan's associate came to their house, how he used kind tones and quick hands, the way signatures were asked for under pressure, and the way phone calls became more frequent until the contract was a fact. Each story landed like a measured blow. At one point, one of them, a man named Harold, looked Ethan straight in the eye and said, "You told me it would be easy. You told me my grandchildren would be safe. You told me you'd take care of everything. You took my savings instead." The room went quiet enough to hear a crow outside the trees. Ethan tried to laugh it off. "They don't understand real estate," he said, petulant. "They signed because they were advised. I never forced anyone." His voice had the cheap plausibility of a man used to selling ideas and moving on. Tommy had recorded calls that matched the phrasing the clients described. We played one quietly on a small speaker. Ethan's voice was there, softer than in person, smoother, the exact inflection an investigator lives for. The moment he said, "This is just paperwork to speed things up." And then, "You don't need to worry about the fine print." The matching of voice, date, and client memory was a stitch that pulled the fabric tight. Lydia's face changed slowly, like color filling a ghost. We watched as she watched him. There was a painful gravity to it, the kind a person feels as previous beliefs drop out from under them. Ethan looked for her eyes and found they were not the warm harbor he had expected. They were questions now. "You told me you needed leverage," Lydia said finally, voice small and raw. "You said leverage would get us the loan, the house, the future." She turned to the gathered neighbors. "He put my name on things I never fully understood. He thought I would never notice." His lawyer snapped. "We have contracts that show consent." James unfolded the printed emails and showed where the signatures were obtained, the haste, the misdirection. The contracts looked less like careful agreements and more like traps. The reporter scribbled, the neighbors whispered. The county officer who had come to observe because of the public filing made notes. Ethan's composure broke in small, human ways. His hands trembled. He began to shout accusations about desperate housing markets, pressure, necessity. He accused the elderly clients of misunderstanding, their memories faulty, their signatures misplaced. It was ugly and thin. Then something else happened, something I hadn't fully planned for and yet was the most satisfying of all. An old client, Mildred, produced a bank statement. It had payments marked to a company associated with Ethan's relocation firm. Not a single penny had been used for maintenance or moving. The checks had been forwarded to an account under Ethan's control. The numbers were small enough to be help and big enough to be criminal, and on paper they sang with a clarity that cut through excuses. When the reporter asked for a comment, Ethan stammered. The lawyer advised silence. Silence is a sentence for men who live by sound. We didn't jam him with malice. We showed what was already there. Evidence, witness, recorded voice, public notice. The local paper's reporter wrote notes, feverishly. A photograph was taken of Ethan standing between James and me, his face a mask being made visible by the flash. It's strange how a camera's blink can make someone look very small. Toward the end of the afternoon, the county official, who had been taking notes, stood and said, "Given these affidavits and the apparent pattern of undue influence, we will be opening a formal investigation. There will be subpoenas. In the meantime, all filings related to this property are on hold." It was bureaucratic, which is to say it was permanent. Ethan's attempts to charm or to bully found no purchase. Neighbors, who had formerly nodded at his jokes, now looked at him as you look at a man who's been found out in a room full of people. The room's sympathy had moved to the other side of the table. Even his lawyer's confident posture slackened. Afterwards, he left with the lawyer and slammed his car door so hard the windows shivered. Lydia followed him to the truck, then stopped and came back to the porch. She stood in the doorway for a long time, as if deciding not whether to come in, but whether to be the person who had been in this house when the truth unfolded. She stayed a while, and we didn't speak much. There was no triumphant speech to make. That would have cheapened the day. My victory was not in a shout but in quiet clearing. The house, for the first time in a long while, felt like it belonged to the memory of Martha again, not to someone who thought family was a ledger item. That evening the small newspaper's online post went up. The headline was sober: Local Property Inquiry Leads to Allegations of Undue Influence. The comments were a mix of outrage and sympathy. Ethan's phone started ringing with calls he couldn't charm away, one from his bank asking questions, one from a former contractor who wanted to discuss unpaid work, and one from a woman who'd been interviewed for the article and wished to add more details. The next week the county investigators subpoenaed records. The bank froze a suspicious account. Complaints began to appear in a thread of paperwork that made the simple math of Ethan's scheme look not like genius but greed. Through it all I kept one rule: never gloat. I answered questions plainly. I told the reporter the facts and left the judgments to the legal process. People who are humbled by the truth often find their humanity in private later, and I didn't want to break that. What I wanted, what I had set the machine to produce, was exposure, accountability, and the chance for Lydia to decide without fog. When Lydia came by a few days later, she brought a small box of notes she had written herself, lists of memories, moments she didn't want traded for deals. She sat down and cried, not angry now so much as raw. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said through a hand pressed to her mouth. "I didn't see it." "You're not to blame," I told her. "He was clever. He used love like a tool." She looked at me and, for the first time in weeks, smiled, the small, real smile she used to have when we watched old westerns together. "Thank you," she said, and she stayed for dinner. Ethan's life didn't collapse overnight. Men like him have options, legal counsel, spin, and friends who will listen. But the exposure had the kind of force that questions cannot survive. When the bank called, when the clients demanded restitution, when the county listed an investigation in black and white, he found his plans harder to pivot. The charm that had once paved him through open doors now found them barred. I didn't celebrate. I lit a cigar on the back porch and watched the smoke curl up into the trees. The woods smelled the same as they always had: pine, earth, the small rot of fallen leaves. The house felt quieter but safer. Martha's picture faced forward on the mantel. I poured out a little bourbon as I always did, a small private thing. Justice had arrived in the form of paperwork, witnesses, and a town that would not let the story sleep. It was not spectacular. It was correct. And as the sun slid behind the pines and the first moths began to dot the light, I felt the kind of tiredness that comes after a long day's work, the right tiredness. The kind that says a job was done the way it should be, carefully, with hands that know the grain. The cabin always smelled of pine after rain. That evening the air outside was cool and clear, and for the first time in months the silence felt like company instead of punishment. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, bourbon could wait, and watched fog rise off the creek below. A hawk circled once over the treeline and disappeared into the light. The story had made its rounds by then. The county's investigation moved forward. The newspaper ran a follow-up naming the alleged developer, only once, then focusing on elder fraud awareness and property rights reform. The bank seized the relocation firm's accounts. Ethan resigned from the agency before they could ask him to. His parents went back to the city, leaving behind nothing but a dent in the gravel where their car used to park. Lydia stayed away for 3 weeks. Then, one quiet Sunday, I heard tires on the road again. No Tesla this time, just her old Corolla, dusty and unpretentious. She stepped out wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, hair tied back the way she used to when she painted as a teenager. She looked different, smaller in posture, stronger in eyes. "Hi, Dad." "Hey, kiddo." We stood for a moment, awkward but willing. Then she crossed the porch and hugged me like she was afraid I'd vanish. I didn't realize until that second how much I'd missed the weight of that simple trust. Inside, the fire crackled. We talked slowly, cautiously, like people testing thin ice. She told me Ethan had left town, somewhere near Dallas, chasing a new start. She didn't follow. The divorce papers were ready. James had helped her file them. "I kept thinking I could fix him," she said, staring into the flames. "You can't fix a man who doesn't think he's broken. I know that now." She reached into her bag and pulled out a photo, Martha holding baby Lydia, both of them squinting against the sun. "I want to frame this again," she said. "For here. If that's okay." I nodded. It always was. Life settled into smaller rhythms. I rebuilt the garden fence, repaired the gutters, stacked the firewood for winter. The neighbors stopped by more often. Mrs. Calloway brought jars of jam. "For your nerves." The town paper printed a thank you letter from the Hendersons, the elderly couple Ethan had tricked. They wrote, "Sometimes justice wears work boots." I kept that clipping folded in my wallet. At night, the cabin changed its sound. The house used to creak with loneliness, now it breathed. Lydia would visit on weekends, bringing groceries or sketches. She'd sit by the window drawing trees while I read the paper. Sometimes we didn't speak for an hour, and that silence was better than any conversation. I started volunteering with a small legal aid group that James recommended, helping retirees understand property forms before signing anything. It wasn't hero work, just patient translation, fine print into plain English. Maybe that was my penance for letting Ethan close enough to hurt my daughter. Maybe it was simply purpose. One afternoon, after class at the community center, I came home to find a letter on the porch. No stamp, just handwriting I recognized. Ethan's. The note was short, shaky. Jack, I've lost almost everything. I know you'll think I deserve it. Maybe I do. But I never meant to hurt Lydia. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I hope she builds something better than what I tried to steal. I folded the paper once, twice, and placed it in the same drawer as Martha's old recipes. Not forgiveness, not vengeance, just record. People should leave traces of what they learn. Sometimes I still catch myself replaying the moment he said leverage. It wasn't just a business term, it was the opposite of love. Love doesn't press down to lift itself. It holds steady so someone else can stand. That difference is what this whole storm was about. Justice didn't come with applause. It came with paperwork, long days, and the quiet dignity of truth surviving noise. But it did come. And maybe that's enough. A few weeks later, Lydia and I drove into town for groceries. She asked if she could take the wheel. The road curved through the woods, sunlight flashing between trees. Halfway there she laughed, light, sudden, free. I realized it was the first time I'd heard her laugh like that since before the Tesla, before the folder, before the lie. What? I asked. Nothing. Just feels good to breathe again. That's all any of this was for, I said. We passed the sign that read Austin County Line, and the radio caught an old song Martha loved. Lydia reached over and turned it up. For a while we sang off-key together, badly but sincerely. Winter came early that year. The woods went silver with frost. On the morning the county closed the investigation, I received a letter confirming that the property, and all associated filings, were cleared, uncontested, and solely mine. The paper was cold to the touch, but it felt warm enough to melt the lingering anger. That night I built a fire, poured 2 bourbons, and set one glass beside Martha's photo. Outside, the moon rested over the creek like a promise kept. I spoke softly just once. It's done, love. We're safe again. The house answered with the quiet pop of burning pine. Revenge hadn't healed me. It rarely does. But justice, steady, patient, deliberate, had carved space for peace. And in that space, forgiveness might someday take root. I looked at the flames, then at the empty chair across from me, and smiled. Justice is colder than love, I thought, but it lasts longer. If this story moved you, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment with your thoughts. To continue the journey, click the box on the left for the next story. Thank you for being here.